Move aside thoughts of thrones and dragons, leave your wands and singing hats at home, because we're going through the granddaddy of all rockstar fantasy series with a fine-tooth comb, and finding those details only the most dedicated of fans may notice. I'm Chris Goodmakers, and these are tiny details only fans noticed in Lord of the Rings. Fellowship starts off with a blatant lie. A lie we all have been spreading and celebrating since the release of The Hobbit way back in 1937. If you were not aware, the entire history and mythos of Middle-earth are told through the lenses of a history being relayed through a historian. What we know as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, in-universe, is the Red Book of Westmarch. Tolkien is said to have simply translated the stories, being the extreme language nerd he was. With the gross simplification understood, we get to the names. There was no Hobbit named Frodo Baggins, or one named Bilbo. Bilbo Baggins. These two adventurous halflings are in reality known as Maura and Bilba Labingi. And who is Maura's close dearest friend? None other than Banazir Galpsy, who Tolkien lovingly translated to Samwise Gamgee. Tolkien himself said that he started writing languages at 13 or 14, which explains the level of magnificent detail on display in his masterwork that is Middle-earth. Speaking of Tolkien, there's a common myth amongst fans that he gave his blessing to Sir Christopher Lee to eventually play Gandalf the Grey. This is false, but the actor who would adorn the grey robes also shared a connection with the professor, albeit beyond the grave. When preparing for the role of Gandalf, Ian McKellen listened and studied tapes of the writer's voice, slowly building on his own to create the accent we hear as Gandalf.
Yeah, no, I don't desire to go and have afternoons talking Elvish to chaps.
You didn't think I'd miss your Uncle Bilbo's best.
McKellen's natural voice, while sharing a strong English accent, is much less deep and raspy. His words blend together with a smooth lyrical quality. Tolkien, in contrast, spoke in a lower tone. His words chugged along with a staccato. If you haven't listened to old interviews of him, then I do recommend it. Sometimes bloopers and accidents can become so ingrained in a movie, they become some fans' favorite fact about it. Like the one stormtrooper who hit their head on the door. Sometimes actors have a difficult time staying in character. Take, for example, Ewan McGregor in Revenge of the Sith. That hand hiding his mouth is because he's actually laughing about telling Padme about the slaying of younglings. This is an extremely emotional scene, one with sadness and frustration over the loss of his apprentice. So his laughter isn't because killing kids is funny, but because of the stark contrast between the words he's speaking and the reality in which he lives. Not to say McKellen isn't the brilliant actor that he is, but in this scene when he causes bodily harm to himself, he stays in character. Bag End is more than just a joke about cul-de-sacs. It's the ancestral home of the Baggins family, having been burrowed by Bilbo's own father Bungo himself. So it's no surprise he would honor his parents by hanging their portraits above his fireplace. These two are of Belladonna and Bungo Baggins, respectively, who are both integral to the story of Bilbo and thus Frodo. Belladonna is a took, and tooks are fallowhides. They are the most adventurous of hobbits. Bungo is obviously a Baggins, and Baggins are Harfoots. Harfoots are much more sedentary in comparison. Bilbo's constant coming and going is because of this inner turmoil. He is both the son of a Harfoot and the son of a Fallowhide, being called to action again. If he had not been, he wouldn't have been able to inspire Frodo, who wouldn't seek to destroy the ring. Plus, there is another thread in these portraits, but we'll get to that next. Sam Raimi is an extremely celebrated director, and for good reason. One of his many quirks, however, is his love of Bruce Campbell, and his continued use of him in his films. Why this is important is because Sam Raimi was an inspiration to Peter Jackson, who couldn't help but pull a Hitchcock and sneak his own cameos into these films. The Fellowship has carrot-munching Albert Dreary, who was supposed to be smoking but thankfully dropped the bad habit. Two Towers gave us a spear-throwing soldier, and Return of the King may be referring to Jackson as one of the pirates amongst the Black Ships. He even gets killed by Legolas himself. But little did we know that he's been there since the beginning of the first movie, hanging just above our heads. Remember those portraits of Bilbo's parents? Well, they're made in the likeness of the New Zealand director and his wife. You may have missed it, but hobbits generally don't grow beards, so Peter's likeness was done beardless. Traveling to a populated tavern where the average patron stands almost twice your size is a daunting task for any wannabe adventurer. And so Frodo chooses a rather on-the-nose alias.
Underhill. My name's Underhill.
Mr. Underhill is a pretty on-the-nose name as far as aliases go, and there's probably a reason why. Think back just 77 years earlier to his first second cousin once removed on either side. When Bilbo is speaking with Smaug, he tells the winged fire drake that he lives under the hill, a statement that earns him the name Underhill. We know Frodo knew of the story, so it's more than plausible that the name Underhill was brought forth from his mind in a time of need. It might also explain why that innkeeper looks so suspicious. I'm going to take this time to talk about just how underrated and underused the dwarves are. The mountain-dwelling, dirt-digging dwarves are far more than just miners and smithies. Starting with Durin the Deathless, the dwarves have a direct line to the Valar. They are near fireproof, know no disease of man, and are the hardiest of any. So while you may base your D&D character off the slender half-elves with a melodramatic background, I choose instead to honor those who toil under the surface, to mine the metal your gaudy swords will be made of, even if I have to be around only 5 feet at the tallest. Which is a feeling John Rhys-Davies probably had, seeing as the 6'1" Welsh actor portrays one of the second smallest races in all of Middle-earth as Gimli. But he gets to voice the 14-foot Treebeard, so split the difference. Compared to his elvish family, Aragorn's life is but a blink of an eye. His adopted father Elrond is just about 6,500 years old by the time he is betrothed to his beloved Arwen, who is herself almost 3,000 years. Yet Aragorn himself is no stranger to longevity, being but a mere 87 years old by the time of the movies. So then why does he have the good looks of Viggo Mortensen? Well, as you already know, he is the vastly distant direct descendant of the great Isildur. This is extremely important. Not only was Isildur the leader of the Dunedain, he was one of the last from the lost island of Numenor. That's a huge can of worms we don't have time for, but what's important is that the rulers were descendants of a certain half-elf, and so their lifespans were longer than the average. Meaning thousands of years later, the 88-year-old ranger can be the heartthrob we see on screen. Sean Bean is best known for his refusal to stay dead. No matter how many times we as a society kill him off in our media, he just won't stop making us fall in love with him. If you had somehow known this trope and didn't know the fate of the fateful Boromir, you'd probably guess it. While defending his halfling friends, he is shot by 3 orc arrows in an ambush. Very reminiscent of another warrior we saw in the prologue. Isildur is tempted by the ring and betrayed by it, then shot by 3 arrows and left to die. Boromir is tempted by the ring, but resists. He dies in battle and gets to die with honor. So this is a quick entry that just sets up the far more interesting 11th one. The light of Erendil flows in the water that Galadriel gives to Frodo. Erendil was an elf that through great deeds rose to become a star. And also, he was the father of one of Galadriel's oldest friends, Elrond. Which brings us nicely to... Within their specific races, most of the main cast share familial blood. Let's start with the oldest pair of Galadriel and Elrond. As I stated before, they are indeed related through marriage. But before that, they were first cousins, on both sides, similar to Frodo and Bilbo. But I'm sure you knew that already. Elrond and Aragorn are extremely related. Not only was Elrond his adoptive father, but he is also his great, more times than I care to count, granduncle. See, the first leader of the Lost Island of Numenor was Elrond's own brother, who gave up immortality. Thus began the long lineage that would eventually lead to Aragorn. Elrond is Arwen's father, so that marriage is of 2 step-siblings. Oh, that's creepier than The Flash. But also technically making Aragorn and Arwen first cousins, just many times removed. But that's not all. Not all dwarves are related, thankfully. In fact, the 7 original dwarves were separated at different corners of Middle-earth, but everyone we see on screen comes from the very same kind of Durin folk. The halflings have a much healthier family tree compared to elves and men. Lord of the Rings was of huge importance to New Zealand, as it stood on the world stage, whether it be from the world visiting Hobbiton, or a Kiwi being asked if they live there. This relationship is the source of a lot of humor in the classic comedy series, Flight of the Conchords, a show following the fictional lives of the real band of the same name, made up of Brett McKenzie and Jermaine Clement. They even have a song devoted to the lovable hobbit, Frodo. But the connection goes the other way around as well, with Brett McKenzie shaving his stubble and presenting himself as Figwit, which is a fan-given name that stands for Frodo is great. Who is that? He's not the world's most important elf, but he is most definitely a cameo that most people would miss. And when you're finished this video, go watch all of Flight of the Conchords. It's amazing.
How come Jermaine likes it so much?
You can have it.
Tolkien had changed his mind on Balrogs in his life. By the time Gandalf met one, they were great, powerful beasts. This explains why people in the Silmarillion can defeat 7 at a time, while the Grand Gandalf the Grey dies fighting one. But how does he stand a chance to begin with? Well, Gandalf, and indeed all of the 5 wizards, are former Maiar themselves, where Balrogs are twisted by Morgoth. The wizards were chosen by the other Valar to come to Middle-earth to sway the free people away from and against the likes of Sauron. The only difference is that Gandalf has his power lessened to an extent in his human form. His empathy and kindness is so ingrained in him that it is the very reason he is brought back from the dead. No matter your feelings about it, serious changes are always needed when adapting a book to a film. The removal of fan favorites like Bombadil is a good example, a victim of the fat trimming that is Saruman and his final battle. In the movie, he is simply stabbed by Wormtongue and then impaled. Yeah, not the most grandiose of deaths. The book, however, reveals so much about him in his final days. He was making rings of power of his own, claiming the colors of his brethren, and absolutely destroying the Shire. The scouring of the Shire is of huge importance to the history of the Hobbits, and the loss of the party tree is what finally gives the Hobbits their own magical tree. The movie removes these events entirely, but the imagery is used in Frodo's vision, seeing the Shire left in ruin. This sort of semi-following the source material is unfortunately the best we can get under the circumstances. I mean, did you really want to watch another hour after that ending? Don't answer that. Lee was always a huge fan of Lord of the Rings. He read the books every year up until his death, but his life was filled with far more than just dragons and elves. Sir Christopher Lee fought in World War II. After that, he gained notoriety as an actor with his role in Dracula, as Dracula, and his villainous reputation started there. The man made a metal album called Charlemagne, who Lee is actually a descendant of. So when Peter Jackson told him how to act when getting stabbed in the back, Lee was sure to correct him. You ever wonder what Frodo had that Isildur didn't? If you read the books, you may think very little before the rings tainted Isildur's mind. How was this hobbit able to withstand the will of the Dark Lord himself? Well, the secret is, he hadn't. At the end of the day, there's only been 2 people we've seen on screen willingly give up the ring. Sam and Bilbo. Sam gives the ring back to Frodo, though not without thoughts of endless gardens he could rule. And Bilbo finally leaves the ring after much pressure from the Grey Wizard. Beyond them, everyone else is forced to give it up somehow. The ring is taken from Sauron, betrays Isildur, is robbed from Deagol, and finally betrays Gollum. Bilbo is the first one to ignore the temptation to keep it. We've been over Sam's wielding of it, but what about the ending? Frodo refuses to throw the ring like Isildur before him, and Gollum lunges for it. The next few shots are important because both are fighting to keep the ring, not their lives. The ring is forcing them not to destroy it, so when Gollum falls to his death, he is still religiously holding his precious over the fire. Nobody can fully withstand the ring's temptation. Books and classes can and are taught on these stories for a very good reason. Tolkien was a brilliant writer and a brilliant mind. In order to do any justice to the complexity of his work, we would need days. So hopefully this can act as the wick in the candle which you will hold to the great works of J.R.R. Tolkien.